Edina's work with learning technologists helps to develop skilled, data-literate students who can change our world for the better. Teachers and students can develop and share coding skills with Notable, our Jupyter Notebook service. Our Digimap services deliver high-quality mapping data for all stages of education. Future developments include a text and data mining service, working with satellite data and machine learning, and smart campus technology. Edina's work with learning technologists helps to develop skilled, data-literate students who can change our world for the better. Teachers and students can develop and share coding skills with Notable, our Jupyter Notebook service. Our Digimap services deliver high-quality mapping data for all stages of education.
Our little session that we'll be running here in McEwen Hall. First up, we have Sandra Huskinson and Rich Goodman from University of Loughborough, who'll be talking about transforming the transition Btech students to higher education. So over to you, thank you.
Okay, good afternoon everybody. It's such a pleasure to be in such a wonderful venue this afternoon. I'm going to talk to you with Rich about a project that we've run at Loughborough to help Btech students actually transform themselves into higher education students at the beginning of the year. So this project was actually developed with a few other universities, so with Queen Mary, Exeter and the University of Birmingham. And we wanted to look at the way that Btech students actually did induction when they came to university. So we did interviews, look at the theory of change, the difference between Btech students and A-levels, for which we did focus groups, interventions, and we've got a findings report from this data. The drivers were diversity and actually encouraging more Btech students to actually attend university after they've completed their Btech. We'd identified a gap potentially in study skills for these students, and like I said, the project was aimed at pre-arrival to university, and we looked at the idea of delivering this package online. So the research behind this, I don't know whether you all know, but 26% of university applicants are in fact Btech students. And these Btech students are often academically less successful students who enter than traditional A-level students. They are more likely to drop out in their first year, and they actually come from a more social, economically disadvantaged background or from ethnic minority background, and live in areas which have low HE participation. So we looked at the student experience in itself. So we did one-to-one interviews to collect data and also focus groups. We spoke to first-year HE students and second-year FE students to see what their attitudes were to actually attending HE and what problems they'd encountered in doing this and what the differences were with their A-level colleagues. The majority were Btech students, but we also spoke to some A-level students, and we wanted to actually provide that comparison. So in terms of lecturers and FE tutors also provided some more data on this sort of issue. So we had quite a lot of interesting comments also from our Btech students. They'd actually come into the university and we looked at them at the end of the first year to see what issues that they'd actually had. So some had never done exams for a long period of time, so maybe when they were at school they did exams, but in their Btech they'd not done exams, so they had a whole new learning experience from that. They had problems with maths, they had issues with English and writing in a more academic style. They also had a feeling of disenfranchisement from the actual community itself because the majority of the students are actually A-level students. So in terms of doing this, we looked at the idea of improving retention, making the induction process more inclusive for these particular students, and also addressing some of the gaps in study skills. We wanted to improve diversity. We wanted to provide something that was more interactive for these students when they arrived, to form a community. We wanted them to feel that they were equal to the A-level students, and we wanted to use an online platform to deliver this. And I'm actually going to let Keith Pond actually talk to you about our thoughts on this process.
Well, our initial research with Btech students in FE colleges and with our own undergraduate students on their first year of entry were that there were certain skills that they felt they needed a lot more practice on, a lot more development of. These skills were in writing, academic writing, they were in maths particularly, and the skills, the transition skills, working in a different way, working differently, working in groups, working to a high level with different people from different backgrounds. Well, our initial research...
Sorry, it's not moved on, has it?
Well, our initial research with...
So basically what we've ended up with is a different sort of island for sea for people to navigate if you're a Btech student. So you recognise you've got a skills gap, and also you've got transitional issues to do with how you feel and the community that you're involved with. So I'm actually going to stop there and get you to think about the project overall. Now, at this point, you can see that we've done the research. You can see that we're ready to do some sort of intervention, and the other universities involved in this project were all in that position. But we decided actually that we didn't want to do something that was just recycling of induction materials we already had. We wanted to actually do something different with the actual interface itself that we were going to use, which is our VLE. And also, within this actual project, there wasn't actually much funding to support a big team producing an interface. There was actually only me at the end of the day, and I was only given 30 hours. So if you think of it as enter stage right, the learning technologist, 2 months before the actual project was going to be produced. And I was actually only given 30 hours to actually produce this project. So in terms of that, we were up against it from the start, but we were sure that we wanted to produce something slightly differently. And we also wanted to change the way that we'd normally deliver these materials. So one of the first things I looked at was actually looking at collaborating with the Btech students we had that were in the first year or finishing the first year. So we asked them to get involved in what we were going to produce. Because we're sporty at Loughborough, we decided to call this module warm-up. So we got some students involved, we went out and did some video, we looked at the idea of them peer supporting this actual module rather than us, and making the community for these students to enter and improve their study skills. We also looked at having a diagnostic quiz. So that's our current interface as it is. There, and I'm going to get Rich to come up and actually talk about the way that we changed the interface to improve the way that we deliver things. So on this, we were going to put a different spin on what we normally do in our VLE, just for these students.
Thanks, Sandra. So this is a screenshot from our VLE, which is called Learn. It's been called Learn for 20 years now. It's gone through many different iterations, and we've been using Moodle for about 12 years now. So this is our interpretation of Moodle. We've got 3 different themes that we can use, plus a different theme that's on the mobile device. And we've kind of put a lot of work into iterating this over the years to kind of get it to how we have it looking, which is reasonably nice. And it gets reasonably good feedback. But more and more over the last few years, we've seen lots of people wanting to just change something slightly, try and make it a bit less like a VLE. These VLEs that are supposed to be dead again this year, as they were 10 years ago. They're still not dead, but it's there. It works. People love it. So we get lots of requests, and we've been working with lots of colleagues across campus, including Sandra and some other people around in different areas, just to try and make the VLE look a little bit less like a VLE, because you've got all these little things like the navigation block you can see there in the top left, a bit of stuff in the module administration area for students to see activity results, things like reading list and the module card. Now these are all applicable to this particular module. This is a standard undergraduate module, but when we start to fit in things like warm-up, we need to try and adapt the approach and see how things are going to work for those students that have got no idea what all of this stuff would mean to them. So leaving it there would be far too confusing. So we took this approach of making some adaptations just to make it look a little bit less like a VLE, even though underneath it's still exactly the same. So now in the top right here you can see the screenshot of this particular module course in other people's parlance, but we call them modules, for the warm-up project. And you'll see the little blocks that we've got dotted here around the screen of the things that we used. So there's nice colourful icons to move students around to the different areas, go to the quiz, look at all the different skills that they need to use, watching the video. So this is all, again, based on the standard Moodle and the standard Moodle experience, but by taking away some of those little blocks in there that make no sense to the students who are going to be on this warm-up course because they've not been at the university and don't know what all these things mean. It just makes their experience just that little bit nicer to be able to come in and just fiddle around with the page a bit. For our standard undergraduate students and postgrads, they want a reasonably consistent experience where everything is in the same place. If they go onto the module, then the lecture capture block is on the top right-hand side, and there's a reading list block down there, and there's a few other things, and things move around, and you get different module formats like grid and buttons and all these other kind of things. But for this module, it was much better to have this much more tailored approach, which had a much better experience for those students who are working on this module. And then if they come along and transition to be Loughborough students, then they'll still see a lot of these elements when they come and take their undergraduate modules, but they'll just get a bit more familiarity and experience. Okay. Back to Sandra.
Okay. Back to technology. Right. Basically, we had then a piloting phase for this module. We ran it with students definitely before they came. They had to confirm they were coming first, and then Rich organised some guest module access in order for them to go in. Like I said before, we had a diagnostic quiz, which we produced, and that gave them an idea which area of study they wanted to do, whether they wanted to look at transitional skills, whether they wanted to look at the math skills. It gave them a rating to see where they were in those things, and gave them a test to be able to do that. So in terms of this, it ran successfully with peer support from the students that we've recruited. There was a forum and various questions were produced in terms of an idea of what students' issues were with that sort of thing. It ran very well over that pilot period. But in sort of tandem with this, the university then decided to produce their own induction material, so we've run it once, and then the university's main induction actually has taken over. But we've still got the resources from that, which fed into that actual process. So I'm going to let Keith have the final word and actually tell you all what we actually learned from this process.
Well, we learned three key things. We learned that, yes, there is a gap in the development needs of not only Btech students, but also A-level students, or students coming to university, development of the skills they will need to succeed in their courses. We also learned there was quite a gap between what the universities were preparing and had available for students to develop those skills and the skills needs that these students had. And one third thing that we learned was that when we do have a project that people believe in, that is reasonably well funded, it brings in lots of voluntary help, lots of different skills, and people feel really good about providing a project that has such positive results. Well, we learned three key things. We learned that, yes, there is a gap in the development needs of...
I'll escape out of there. Right, and there are the references for this project. We are looking at putting the diagnostic quiz out as a OER free resource, so please look out for that. Because we're now no longer using it in there. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much indeed. That was very well timed and a lot in there for us to think about. This time I'm going to go straight to VVox for the questions we've received there. I think it might be coming up on the big screen. But the first one, will any of your course design ideas be adopted by regular undergraduate courses?
Yes, they have. We've got a project to do with induction at Loughborough, which seems to run in parallel with our project, which is called Personal Best. And some of the design ideas were taken into that, particularly the diagnostic quiz, to be used by all the university students, not just these students.
Great, fantastic. And do you want to tackle the top question as well?
We're still looking at using and talking with formed relationships with FE colleges in this actual process. Our local colleges were very much involved in actually designing our content. So yeah, we're still continuing to work with those students and also look at how we might be of more help.
Great, thank you. We've got we've got easily another 4 minutes for questions. Okay. So check if there are any in the audience that have been submitted online already. Yes, down the front here. We'll just bring the mic to you. And if you could say who you are as well, please, when you ask your question.
Hi, I'm Laura Hollinshead from the University of Derby. I was just wondering if you're planning to track the retainment and achievement of those students who perhaps have taken the course.
There are no plans as such at the moment. I think the university decided that it would be better to use our actual current personal best stuff to cover a blanket cover of everybody rather than track the individual students. So not at this point.
Thank you. Any other questions in the audience? Okay, we have another on the VVox. What's the connection with Future Learn?
In terms of Future Learn, we looked at Future Learn as an inspiration for looking at the way that we would construct the actual course. We've not got the course to show you today, but we looked at the way that you navigated through the course and also the way that Future Learn produced interactivity. So we used that as a basis to design what we did in the end.
Great, thank you. Just a final check for any other questions in the audience. In which case, if we thank Sandra and Richard again, please. And we'll just be a minute or two until we get set up with our next speaker. So just bear with us for a moment. So, you are
Danielle.
Danielle, okay. And Richard.
Yes.
Okay, and where are you guys from?
King's College.
King's College, okay. Well, we've still got a couple of minutes to go, but are you pretty much set up?
I think we're pretty much there.
Well, colleagues, our next speakers are ready. We're just a minute ahead of time, but as I think everyone's staying anyway, we will just crack on. So we now have Daniel Johnston and Rachel Wall from King's College London, who will be talking about podcasts, the new MOOCs. So over to you.
Excellent, thank you so much. Well, to just get us started, we're going to just do a quick activity. So if you're able, could you raise your hand?
Cool, so do you want to put your hand down if you have an Alexa or a Google Home?
Okay, lower your hand if you've taken an audio tour at a museum.
Excellent. Do you lower your hand if you pay for Spotify or Apple Music?
Lower your hand if you've done a Duolingo or Rosetta Stone activity.
Oh, is that everyone? Oh no, a couple more. Lower your hand if you've ever listened to Serial, the podcast.
Lower your hand if you have headphones with you today.
Oh, last one. Lower your hand if you've ever been to a live performance. Ah, there we go. So what this exercise really shows is how immersive and versatile that audio actually is. It's used in a variety of different places, in loads of different contexts, and for various purposes. As a medium, audio is really flexible. It's cheap and it's easy to consume.
And perhaps one of the cheapest and most flexible forms of audio for consumers is podcasts. So what are podcasts? At their most basic form, it's an audio clip that you can access through the internet, you can download or stream. We can be more specific in that and say it should be delivered through an RSS feed so you can subscribe to it. But for our purposes, we also think that there's a social and cultural definition that we need to come to terms with. That we have certain expectations about what a podcast is today, that it's a media form as well as a technology. And that's really informed by the way that people are creating and consuming podcasts.
Cool. So what do we know about podcasts today? Well, lots of people are listening to them and lots of people are making them. But where did this come from? How did they take off? Well, Richard Berry writes in 2015 about what he calls this golden age of podcasting, which was launched by the popularity of the podcast Serial. So how it all started, podcasts were really this rival to radio. Producers and listeners had this opportunity to really explore really niche topics and really take advantage of on-demand listening. And these advances in technology could really control what people were listening to and when they listened. So when we think about Serial, it arrived at what Berry describes as this golden age of podcasting in 2014. The podcast arrived when it really mirrored what he describes as the classic narratives and the experiences of audiobooks. And it really prompted listener engagement. People really had a mental and emotional connection with the topics that they were listening to. The content was really topical, really culturally relevant, and it really sparked loads of conversations. People had loads of questions, they had debates, they had agreements, they had disagreements. And this engagement and this word of mouth really created this overall shared experience. And really the popularity of Serial kickstarted what Berry describes as this golden age of podcasting, as we know podcasts, and how they've risen today.
So in a golden age of podcasts, it's not surprising that we've started to look at the application of the technology to learning and how that can be done. And typically, scholars have looked at bespoke podcasts created for very specific learning aims, learning environments, and specific courses. But what about the podcasts like Serial? Podcasts that are created for the general public, for entertainment, but have arguably really serious content that can help us to learn. Well, this is really what drew us to our main research question, which is that can listening to these mainstream podcasts be described or interpreted as a learning experience? So to explore this, we decided to look closely at the podcasts themselves. We found a list of the 50 most popular podcasts on a particular day and selected 4 podcasts from this. And we selected them by choosing ones that seemed like they had educational content within them, and also by choosing a range in genre. We then completed an autoethnography where we kept listening journals while we listened to the podcasts and performed close textual analysis on a few episodes to look at the detail.
Cool. So the first podcast that we listened to, which we've already talked about, was Serial. So for those who aren't aware, Serial is an investigative journalism podcast that narrates a non-fiction story over multiple episodes. So when I started my listening journey of listening to Serial, I'd already listened to season 1, so I jumped right into season 2. And just as a really brief description, season 2 investigates the story behind deployed Private First Class Bo Bergdahl, who walked off his post in Afghanistan in 2009, was captured and held captive by the Taliban for 5 years. Wow. So my listening experience of listening to Serial threw up a lot of really interesting points. And the first one that really struck me was the narrative structure of this series. The episodes fit within this overall structure. You need to listen to each of the episodes in order to really gain the full experience and the complete story. And this really maps onto what Walker describes in learning design, in that how narrative really helps us to structure knowledge. It's a really good aid in remembering and imparting knowledge. The other thing that was really significant for me listening to Serial was how the story is told and how information is presented. Producers spoke to a lot of different people. They really took care to get a really balanced account of events as they unfolded. So how does that map onto the listener experience? Well, I decided to go online and have a look at what people were saying about the season. And unsurprisingly, people had a lot to say online. There were huge conversations, huge debates and discussions about the content. And this really maps onto what King describes as this cooperative or jigsaw learning model, where views were taken outside of the listening experience and really debated and discussed outside of the context of learning. And knowledge was really acquired and shared collectively.
The second podcast we looked at was TED Talks Daily, which is basically recordings of TED Talks that were given to live audiences by experts on particular topics. So this felt like a curated collection of lectures. It mapped really directly onto sort of the typical sage on the stage model we see throughout traditional education. In contrast to Serial, the listening experience did not involve starting at episode 1 and working through to the end. Instead, I went through and I selected episodes that seemed interesting or relevant to me. And this way I was able to co-construct my listening and learning experience. The structure of the episodes themselves also resembled a lot of learning experiences that we see. There was scaffolding, so the speaker would establish foundational learning and grow complexity out of that. There was segmenting, selection of data and information and in digestible chunks. In fact, while I was listening, I would often pull out statistical facts that were being shared in the episodes and text them to my husband. But I think what I found most striking about the TED Talks daily episodes was that these speakers, these educators, were clearly not neutral. Scholars like Paulo Freire would have had a field day with this, with these speakers who, while they were sharing empirical research and factual information, were intertwining it with their philosophical beliefs.
Cool. So the third podcast that we looked at was The Guilty Feminist. So The Guilty Feminist is a comedy podcast hosted by Deborah Francis White, and it really explores 21st century topics relevant to women and mostly from the perspective of women. So in a similar way to TED Talks, the engagement in online learning that Walker describes is really evident in how I chose to listen to the episodes that I did for the purpose of our research. I really chose topics that I was either familiar with or topics that I wanted to know a bit more about, or I chose comedians that I knew that I liked. So where and why I listened was also really important in my research. I mostly listened to episodes while I was on the bus during my commute, as a lot of people do. Often I found that I was really deeply engrossed in what I was listening to. We would get 3 or 4 stops ahead and I would not have remembered how we got there because I was really involved in what I was listening to. I even laughed out loud at points, and I'm sure people thought that I was going a bit crazy, but that's the level of engagement. I also listened to some of the episodes at the gym, which I'd never considered doing before, but surprisingly they made my workout go a bit faster, which I was not expecting. But really the significance of this is the environment in which you listen to some of these episodes can really map onto what we already know about learning design, and that it drew a lot of connections with cognitive load theory. This idea that being deeply engrossed in what you're listening to really has your brain and your imagination really heightened in those moments. And in those senses, I was really focused on just listening to what I was paying attention to. And finally, listening to these episodes was a really reflective experience. As a woman myself, I really enjoyed reflecting on the lively debates and discussions that were being talked about, and really drew up thoughts and feelings that I was comparing to the experiences of the guests being spoken to. And the informal but consistent format of all of these episodes really does create this reflective space.
Finally, we looked at Brexit Caste, which is a news show following the events around Brexit. It's hosted by political journalists based in Brussels and Westminster and features guests from around the world. And yet, in the episodes, the hosts and the guests are able to create a really connected discussion despite their geographical distance, something that we look for a lot in distance education and online learning. The hosts also modeled skills for political analysis. So they modeled things like where to get information, how to debate, how to interrogate facts, in ways that really map onto what we know about observational learning. And finally, the Brexit Caste website provided other ways for you to get involved and to learn by taking quizzes or reading blog posts by hosts. So the experience could be really multimodal.
Cool, so we go back to our original question, which explored really whether podcasts can be described as a learning experience. And for us, we thought the overall conclusion was yes. They are learning experiences, and they're in a learning experience that really maps on to MOOCs in the most similar way, in that they're learning objects, they're educational experiences that just really reminded us of that MOOC experience. So how were they similar? Well, they mapped onto what has already been established descriptions of learning in the literature that we reviewed. They have low entry requirements, they're inexpensive to consume, listeners need no prior qualification, knowledge or expertise to listen to them, and they're really similar to MOOCs in that they are massive. We looked at serial productions, download numbers of season 1 and season 2, and their episodes have been downloaded more than 250 million times, showing just how far and wide that reaches.
At the same time, mainstream podcasts have a lot of the drawbacks that MOOCs have, so they're difficult to assess, they're difficult to evaluate, but they also have some of the issues around demographics that we've seen criticized in MOOCs. So we had this huge expectation that MOOCs were going to widen participation in education and allow access to people who weren't familiar with traditional routes of education. But in critiques of MOOCs, we've seen that MOOC audiences tend to be degree educated and Western middle class, and that is the same for podcast listeners. So in the US alone, podcast listeners were 40% more likely to have a university degree compared to the general population. Ultimately, you can say that the most distinctive difference between MOOCs and mainstream podcasts is that podcasts are not designed to be learning in the same way that MOOCs and courses are. And yet they're arguably a more flexible and mobile and less bandwidth intensive way to engage people with educational content. So what does this mean for us?
So podcasts definitely have this opportunity to widen participation, to democratize knowledge and to democratize learning. Here at King's, we have a couple of different teams and departments who already engage in podcasts for the purpose of disseminating information and for discussing their research. This is a page from our War Studies department who have really grown their podcast following, discussing their current research and up-to-date developments on areas that they're speaking in and they lecture in on a regular basis.
It should also impact the way we think about MOOCs. So what if we start thinking about MOOCs as more similar to podcasts as a media form rather than formal courses? It's really important for people like us who work in online learning.
Cool, so why is this important to us? So we both work in an online learning team where we work with audio on a daily basis. And this really started from a desire from us to understand how we currently use audio in our daily working practices. So we started with an interrogation into our instructional design process. How do we work with audio at the moment? Well, we interviewed our instructional designers to find out what their thoughts were and came out with some really interesting insights. Our instructional designers talked about the really inventive ways that we have for the potential use of audio in online learning, ways that are really rich in evidence. And their descriptions really mapped onto Middleton's premise of audio as being a really rich learning space. And in general, their personal consumption of non-learning focused audio really highlighted how much of an entertainment media it is in guiding and inspiring learning design. So overall, we thought we really need to start thinking more broadly about what is digitally enabled learning.
So ultimately, this research is more of a beginning than a conclusion. It raised an enormous number of questions for us, and it has a huge number of limitations. So we need to keep asking more questions about the design of audio media for learning, but also about how to extend education to massive cohorts of learners, about the ever-blurring lines between formal and informal learning experiences, and the identity of universities as learning providers in a world of increasingly free and open content.
Thank you very much.
Thank you both very much. Perfectly timed, and we have just under 5 minutes for questions. So I'll ask if we can get the VBox window up. Quite a few things have come in. Can the talks in the tower be put into bigger rooms? You don't have to answer that. That's clearly a question that's come from elsewhere. But I wonder if we could just, I'll let you pick maybe the first one of those you want to engage with.
Do you want to do the learning disabilities one? Danielle, do you want to do the second one?
Yes, absolutely. So I think this is a really important question. So it's about to what extent podcasts and other audio can be relevant in the context of participants with with hearing disabilities. So I think podcasts have advantages with accessibility, so they can be a great advantage to, for instance, people with dyslexia who might struggle with reading, but they also have drawbacks in that if you're not able to hear, you're not able to consume them. So I would recommend for anyone who's considering creating audio or podcasts to provide an alternative. So in our practice, when we create audio for online learning, that's something we've invested in, is that we get a human transcription of all our audio.
Great, thank you. And you talked a lot about the kind of MOOCs as well, and there's a question there. MOOCs are built around connectivism and peer-to-peer interaction. How can podcasts be interactive, or I guess, how could they be used interactively?
Interesting. I mean, at the moment, we kind of use audio that goes alongside visuals, and certainly something that we would like to do a bit more would be to think about how we talk a lot about like scaffolding and learning, and I think it would be great to make them interactive, but I think we need to kind of go back a few stages and really think about how we can use them to supplement the content that we're already putting out there. I think it definitely is going to be something we should explore in the future, but at the moment, if anybody is doing that, then I would love to hear more from you, because I would be really interested in learning more about that as well.
Okay,
and I think, yeah, the other way that we did see, for instance, with Serial, is that people were connecting in these informal online communities. So there is connection happening. And actually, again, if we go back to the critique of MOOCs, some of the criticisms that we have is that there actually isn't connection happening in MOOCs, especially in the ones that focus more on sort of independent and asynchronous learning.
Okay, thank you very much. We're conscious that these questions will be coming from colleagues in the room, but is there anyone who isn't using the Vvox app who has a question they would like to ask? Yes, gentlemen, third row from the front. And if you could say who you are as well, please.
Hi, my name is Tom Buckley. I come from UE. I'm a digital learning manager there. I just wanted to ask, from your kind of looking at either the research or your own experiences, how did you find your reception of these podcasts? I kind of got the feeling with, I listen to about 20 hours a week. I'm an addict. But I see amongst other people that the intimacy of them and the directness of them sometimes stops the criticality of the content that's being delivered, and it's something that you picked upon at the TED Talks. Is that something that you see? Like, do you think there's sometimes people receive it as the truth rather than something to be discussed?
I think that's a really good point. And yes, we definitely did see that thing with TED Talks, but when I went and looked at reviews of TED Talks, that was also a criticism that listeners were sharing. So they were concerned about that as listeners. I think that we see sort of an equal level of non-neutrality, if you like, in the classroom all the time, in written content. I actually think that there's an extent to which the spoken word leaves a lot more opportunity for critique than the written word. I think there's an extent to which when we see something written down, we take it as being more factual than when we see someone or hear someone speaking it and we realize that it's a point of view.
Great, thank you very much. We're just about on time, so I'm going to have to give apologies to colleagues who posted some of the other questions, but presumably if you're around, you'd be happy to have a chat with colleagues?
Perfect,
Okay,
definitely.
so we can thank Danielle and Rachel, and we'll move on to our final talk. Thank you.
I'm Laura.
You must be Laura.
Yes.
Okay, and are you presenting alone?
Yes, I am, yeah.
So you have 50 minutes to talk. I'll give you a warning when you've got 5 minutes to talk left, and then we've got 5 minutes for questions. So the 5-minute warning will be you've got 5 minutes to talk. 5 minutes left to talk.
Okay.
And then we'll have time for questions.
Okay.
Is that you? Ready to go? Okay, colleagues, for our last talk before we have a break, we have Laura Hollinshead, who's presenting on behalf of herself and colleagues, humanizing the lived experience of mental health patients through immersive video. So Laura, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So I'm here to talk today about an issue that arose when we were looking at teaching our mental health nursing students, and they were finding it difficult to replicate some of the scenarios that the students might encounter in practice within the on-campus learning that was taking place. So with adult nursing, for instance, you would find that people can take blood pressure and use some of the equipment either on dummies or on real patients, but it's actually really difficult to actually replicate the types of scenarios that those students are going to encounter out in practice around mental health patients. We also wanted to make sure that the students could tune into the what it felt like to be a mental health patient in the different situations that those people are going to actually experience within a healthcare setting. So I'm going to play a video here from the discipline lead for mental health at the university. Just get it up.
Hello, my name's Alison Kilduff. I'm Head of Mental Health Nursing at the University of Derby. I've been working with a colleague in learning technology, Laura Hollinshead, and Gemma and Victoria from the mental health nursing team. And we've been working on a project in the past few months to look at the immersive experience, an immersive video experience, to see whether that would be helpful in humanising the lived experience of mental health service users as an element of education around mental health. We know that simulated practice is a really effective way, a very beneficial way for student nurses to be able to develop and practice and rehearse some of the skills. And we also know that some simulated practice techniques are very, very widely used in a whole range of different fields. But in mental health nursing, some of our skills are slightly different, less technical. So we need to find different ways to be able to understand how we help people develop those skills and how we measure whether that learning is helpful or useful and meaningful, most importantly. We want to know whether it can have an impact on practice. We want to think about design and delivery of future sessions if it's a feasible project. So therefore we need to collect feedback because we want to know whether this is worth taking forward and whether we can refine and use it much more widely, both locally, nationally and perhaps internationally in the future.
Okay, so I'm just going to go to my next slide to get to avoid the extra things that are on there. Okay, so one of the things that we wanted to do and ensure we'd done with these videos is that we wanted to make sure that it was actually sustainable. So we wanted to look at these videos being created to be reusable and reusable as much as possible in different contexts. We wanted to make sure that it was also scalable as well, because we've actually seen an increase in our nursing students at the university, partly due to the bursaries changing, and that has obviously created more challenging delivery in terms of the teaching. So we wanted to make sure that this could actually be scaled up. So we tried to keep it as low cost as possible. We based it on a bring your own device aspect as well, so we were utilising the students' use of technology. And all we did really was we actually supplied some headsets for the VR aspects of when we actually used 360 video. So our academic staff wrote the script, and they based this around some of the practice that they'd seen out there when they had been working, but also some of the experiences they may have heard from other people and practitioners out there in the NHS. We looked and focused on recreating the patient's journey at 5 key points within that process. So we looked at a home visit where a mental health practitioner had gone out to the home and was talking about a mission. We looked at a situation where they're actually going onto the ward for the first time, focusing on, the elements that might be a bit different for that person, having never experienced that before. Again, we looked at some communal areas within the wards where they would get admitted and focused on how that experience might feel and the different types of people that they might encounter. We also created a situation where they were outside a meeting room, which they were due to go into. So again, they were hearing and experiencing things there. And then finally, they would attend a multidisciplinary meeting, which is where different healthcare practitioners will come together to discuss the health needs of that individual. So we wanted to make sure that it was really reusable. So we actually made the individual gender neutral, ethnicity neutral. You do not see them, you actually don't hear from them, really to try and help immerse that student within that patient's journey so they can really feel like they are the person that we called it Sam. We also had it so that all of the videos were talking to camera as well, so when they're talking directly to Sam, they're always facing the camera, so it really does feel like you are that person. And when we actually utilised the 360 element, because we didn't use that in all of the videos, we were able to then give the students agency over that situation, so they were able to actually look around and view different aspects of that context, and that they could actually feel like they were the patient and they had control over that situation to an extent. So in creating the videos, it took about a day to film. It had about 25 different people involved in that. Most of those were actually actors within the actual scenario itself. There was academics, we had experts by experience, which are actually ex-patients involved in the filming, and we also had NHS staff as well playing the different roles that we put in there. One of the aspects that took the majority of the time on the day in the filming was to try and ensure that the different people were in the right place at the right time. So, in terms of how this was actually delivered to the students, there was pre-sessions instructions that were actually sent out to the students to try and get them skilled up on using their own devices, to ensure that they were comfortable with doing that. It was delivered as an all-day workshop within a simulated practice module, so as part of one of those sessions. In terms of how we got the videos to the students, we used QR codes and short URLs, so we tried to make it as easy and quick to access as possible. And then we actually gave them a mixture of headsets, but we found that there was a bit of a difference between some people preferred the headsets, some people didn't, some people just used their phone and scrolled around. So it was kind of a bit of both, but a lot of them did actually have a go with the headsets. And really the focus was on the fact that they were using their own technology, so hopefully it's something they're a little more familiar with than picking something up that they haven't used before. So in terms of the numbers of students, this was delivered to 54 students, but this was as two groups, at two different campuses at the university. They were first-year students, and it's important to consider that about 3/4 of the students who actually took part were female, but there was still a good proportion of male students who also took part. So the main part of this is to think about what did the students actually think. So we asked the students to answer three statements, and to look at their agreement for these statements before and after having watched the videos. We didn't actually see a big difference in the agreement levels, because actually most of them agreed to these statements prior to seeing the videos, but we did see a shift in whether they agreed or strongly agreed. So that's where we saw the biggest difference. So it's really that those things were actually kind of backed up by what they already knew, but that their feeling about those felt stronger. So when they were asked around understanding the lived experience, we found that around 16% increase in terms of their agreement to that. In terms of whether they empathised with the lived experience of service users, we had about a 19% increase. And in terms of critically reflecting on the nuances within their own practice, we actually had a 23% increase in terms of their agreement to that statement. So we felt that was really, really positive to see. In terms of they're making changes to their practice, which is one of the key things that we want to see from any of the teaching that we do. 74% of them are actually agreeing to that. And we also had the fact that 94% of them actually got the fact that the videos had made them consider something they'd not thought about before in terms of their practice, which is one of the key things we wanted to get out of this, especially in terms of, you know, a simulation. That's one of the key areas that is the purpose of that type of session. So in terms of how they would actually change their practice, so they wanted to, or we found that again, a lot of this is actually backing up what they already are going to be learning within their courses, but increased empathy, being mindful, being considerate, thinking how the patient feels, reflecting, you know, thinking about the lived experience. You know, just it reinforces the key aspects that we were trying to get out of the session and trying to humanise that experience of the patients. In terms of the video usage, it was half hadn't used VR before. In terms of the headsets, that figure is actually quite high based on what we actually found. A lot of them did use the headsets, but there was at least half of them who were tending to not use them again when they were actually being used for the 360 video. They tended to just revert back to watching it on their devices. So there's quite a lot of them that weren't actually keen on using the headsets. And actually the use of their own device, we would expect that to actually be higher than the figure shown, just because a lot of them are probably thinking about the headsets rather than their actual mobile device. In terms of the effectiveness of the videos, we tended to find that students were really positive about it. And when they were being asked whether they would look at it again, often it was around things that they'd missed in the first time that they looked at it, or areas that had been discussed within the session that they didn't see, but they would like to then go back and view again. So again, it was really positive in terms of the fact that they were interested in re-engaging with those particular resources. In terms of improvements, one of the aspects was around the technical improvements. So there were sound issues. So a lot of them mentioned that there were sound issues on their own devices, and also compatibility with their own devices. Some of this may be down to the fact that some of them didn't do the preparation for the session in terms of actually trying things out before the session, and often came without having done that. So that would obviously improve things, but some of it was also to do with trying to get the VR headsets to work with their own devices, because they wouldn't have had a chance to do that beforehand unless they've got ones at home. So again, some of it was around that. One of the interesting things that came out of this was around authenticity. So we actually had, because there were academic staff in there who they've already seen, that didn't feel authentic to them. So it didn't feel quite as immersive as it could have done if they didn't actually know those individuals. And the other aspect that I found quite interesting was that they didn't like the idea that they couldn't respond as Sam, or they didn't hear Sam's voice as part of it, which partly showed that they didn't feel that they were Sam in that situation, but also it was interesting because I don't really know how you could have actually added that in to actually have them responding as Sam as part of those videos. So in terms of next steps, what we'd like to do is we'd like to see about how we can support other academic staff to do a similar thing. And we'd also like to look at how we can involve interprofessional learning in this. So this was written and created by mental health nursing, but those nursing students will come into contact with lots of different practitioners, social workers, occupational therapists. So it'd be really good to try and combine that. So just to say, there's a couple of QR codes here which do actually link to a couple of the videos if you wanted to have a look at them. And yeah, so any questions?
again, another perfectly timed presentation, so thank you, Laura. I think we'll go to the floor first of all before we look at VVOX. Are there any questions from in the room? Gentleman at the very back row, I think, second back.
Hello, is it on? Yes, it is. Hi, Laura, that's brilliant. Apologies if I didn't notice, but did you say you'd contextualised the videos in terms of activities the students would perform before or after, or do they simply just watch them and reflect on the experience?
So it is contextualised. There's usually a bit of an overview of who Sam is. However, that can be adapted. So you can present that individual with certain mental health conditions, but you can also then change that for another context. So you could then present it to a secondary group of students and then present with a different context. So that's why we've tried to, within the videos themselves, we've tried to keep that out of it a little bit. It does confuse the students to an extent because I think they're expecting something that is heavily contextualised, but it does make them a lot more reusable in terms of actually then going on to use them with other groups of students.
Great stuff. And were there actually activities that the students were expected to perform sort of after watching them? I'm just interested in that sort of context.
Yeah, so they would usually watch one of the videos and then they would then work as a group to discuss what had been seen and then to kind of, so the start of the activity was focused on how that patient's feeling. So how did you feel in that situation? So you're trying to get them to consider how that felt for them as a patient, and then moving on to what practice are you seeing? How could that be improved? You know, what could you do differently in that context?
Great, thank you. And we have another question at the front.
Hi, Sandra Huskinson from Loughborough University. Can you see this particular method using it for another topic or another area of expertise that you might be able to help students with?
We certainly see that this could work really well in a lot of other healthcare subjects. So I've talked to people about using it in social work, occupational therapy, and they've been really interested in doing something similar. Part of it's around the commitment of time to create the actual script, which is the thing that actually takes the longest to do. But also we can see its application in things like policing, law, and other areas where case studies are used quite heavily. I think getting students to immerse themselves in an experience they may not have had before, so we'll work with first-year students who perhaps haven't gone out on placement or have not gone into a work context, would work. So, for instance, in a courtroom, getting to experience that as a witness or, as a defendant might be a really good experience for them to have prior to doing that themselves, because they're not going to necessarily see it from that perspective.
Great, thank you. We had some good engagement on VVOX. I think in at least a couple instances, colleagues have answered each other's questions. So I'm just going to pick out one which is obviously a straight-off question that no one's responded to yet. So this one around, there's a couple around alternatives. So we take this one. Did you consider issuing students with their own Google Cardboard headsets rather than having a mixture of headsets and platforms?
So we did consider doing that, but there was an issue around trying to get access to those and budgets and things like that. So in the end, we've got a central set of VR headsets, hoping that those will work with more different types of technologies that the students have got. But again, actually, because we've not invested in a set for every single student, we got them to share them. And actually that's turned out to be the right thing to do, because a lot of them didn't actually like using them.
Great, thank you. And we will take another question that is hopefully quite straightforward to answer in the last minute. And again, it's about alternatives. The one at the top, H5P is a branching scenario activity. Do you think you could use this app as well? The demo content is similar to what you've been showing us today.
You could do. I think in terms of a branching activity, it does get more complicated. So if you're giving students choices to make, then you're going to have to create more videos. That will take a lot more time. So the different scenarios will then have to be written. So I think the approach that we took was more kind of scalable and doable within the timescale that we had.
Great, thank you very much indeed. Apologies to any questions we didn't get to. We're now on time. Could we thank Laura and our other speakers again for this session, please? And we are now going into a networking break downstairs before we're all back in this room in half an hour or so. Thank you.
Edina's work with learning technologists helps to develop skilled, data-literate students who can change our world for the better. Teachers and students can develop and share coding skills with Notable, our Jupyter Notebook service. Our Digimap services deliver high-quality mapping data for all stages of education. Future developments include a text and data mining service, working with satellite data and machine learning, and smart campus technology. Edina's work with learning technologists helps to develop skilled, data-literate students who can change our world for the better. Teachers and students can develop and share coding skills with Notable, our Jupyter Notebook service. Our Digimap services deliver high-quality mapping data for all stages of education. Future developments include a text and data mining service, working with satellite data and machine learning, and smart campus technology. Edina's work with learning technologists helps to develop skilled, data-literate students who can change our world for the better. Teachers and students can develop and share coding skills with Notable, our Jupyter Notebook service. Our Digimap services deliver high-quality mapping data for all stages of education. Future developments include a text and data mining service, working with satellite data and machine learning, and smart campus technology. Edina's work with learning technologists helps to develop skilled, data-literate students who can change our world for the better. Teachers and students can develop and share coding skills with Notable, our Jupyter Notebook service. Our Digimap services deliver high-quality mapping data for all stages of education. Future developments include a text and data mining service, working with satellite data and machine learning, and smart campus technology.